They thought they were going to fight the Japanese. They had trained for enemy snipers hiding in palm trees, for sudden banzai charges, for ambushes in the thick green walls of the Pacific jungle. But the first thing that struck the American soldiers in the Solomon Islands was not a bullet. It was a mosquito. A tiny, invisible enemy that hummed in the darkness, slipped through sleeves and boots, and brought down entire units without firing a single shot. "This war isn't against men," one Marine wrote home in 1942, "it's against insects." And he wasn't exaggerating. Within weeks of landing on Guadalcanal, more U.S. troops were lying in tents shaking with fever than holding rifles on the front lines. The Pacific War, the soldiers realized, had two fronts, one against Japan, and another against malaria and dengue. When the Americans first entered the jungles of the Pacific, they were unprepared for how merciless the environment would be. The rain never seemed to stop. Every footstep sank into mud. Water formed pools everywhere, puddles in wheel ruts, stagnant ponds behind fallen logs, small swamps that sprang to life overnight. And wherever there was even an inch of still water, mosquitoes bred in the thousands. The Pacific Islands were beautiful from a distance, but up close they were a perfect laboratory for disease. Soldiers had imagined palm trees and beaches. What they found was a humid, suffocating maze full of buzzing swarms that carried invisible death in their wings. The medical officers already knew malaria could hit hard, but no one expected it to dominate the battlefield so quickly. In the first major campaign at Guadalcanal, something shocking happened. Battalions that arrived strong with 800 to 900 healthy men soon had only 300 to 400 soldiers fit for combat. The rest were trembling with fever, sweating through their uniforms, hallucinating, vomiting, or lying unconscious on stretchers. Commanders wrote desperate reports, "We are losing more men to disease than to enemy bullets." One unit lost 65% of its strength in just a month, mostly to malaria. Soldiers had imagined that their greatest danger would come from Japanese machine guns. But in reality, the jungle had its own ways of fighting back. The army tried to teach troops mosquito discipline: roll down sleeves at dusk, keep your neck covered, use repellents, sleep under netting. But new soldiers, young, confident, restless, often ignored these boring rules. Who wanted to sit under a net on a hot night when your skin felt like it was boiling? Who wanted to button every last shirt button at dusk when you could barely breathe in the humid air? The price for this carelessness came quickly. Men who laughed off the warnings found themselves bedridden within days. A soldier who refused to put on repellent during patrols described the moment malaria hit him, the shivering started first. Then the world began to spin. Then it felt like someone was trying to rip my bones out one by one. Malaria didn't kill most men, but it removed them from the fight completely. And that, in war, was a defeat of its own. The U.S. High Command panicked. If entire regiments were falling sick, how could they fight a long island-hopping campaign? Japan still held dozens of islands. The U.S. needed soldiers standing, not shivering on makeshift hospital beds. That's when a bitter yellow pill called atabrine entered the story. Atabrine was a synthetic anti-malaria drug the Americans adopted because Japan had captured nearly all global quinine supplies early in the war. The medicine worked, but there was a problem: it tasted horrible. Not just bitter, but makes your mouth dry and your stomach twist bitter. Some soldiers swore it made their skin yellow. Others believed it caused stomach issues. Rumors spread wildly: atabrine will make you sterile. Atabrine will rot your insides. And in war, rumors travel faster than bullets. By late 1942, medical officers discovered something alarming: huge numbers of troops were secretly throwing away their atabrine tablets. Some hid them under their tongues and spat them out later. Others crushed them and buried them. Soldiers preferred to risk malaria rather than swallow the awful pill. The military realized discipline alone wasn't enough, they needed enforcement. In some units, atabrine parades became routine, men lined up in rows, medics watched them swallow, and everyone had to stick out their tongues to prove they didn't hide the tablet. It was strict, humiliating, and completely necessary. Because once atabrine discipline became part of daily life, malaria cases began to drop. Still, the mosquitoes didn't give up easily. The US had to fight them like another enemy army. Engineers drained swamps, filled waterlogged craters with sand, cleaned out clogged streams, and oiled standing puddles so larvae suffocated. Jungle units cleared vegetation around campsites, burning underbrush to remove breeding areas. Trucks moved with DDT sprayers that fogged entire areas in white chemical clouds, dangerous by today's standards, but a lifesaver then. Doctors formed mosquito control squads that patrolled camps with the same intensity as reconnaissance units. They checked nets, monitored water sources, and even kept track of which species of mosquitoes were active in each zone. In some bases, you could hear the low drone of spray machines all night long. The soldiers eventually adapted. Sunset, once a moment of relief from the heat, became a signal: gear up, sleeves down, repellent on. Nets were treated like weapons. Forgetting one was considered as foolish as forgetting ammunition. Jungle boots were tightened, cuffs tucked tightly, and helmets pulled low to reduce exposed skin. What had once seemed like annoying rules now felt like survival instincts. Men joked that mosquitoes were the fifth column of the Japanese army. Some even claimed the insects were tougher than the enemy. And in letters home, soldiers wrote that they were fighting a war on two fronts. Through all this, commanders learned a hard truth: a healthy soldier is worth more than a brave one. No matter how skilled a unit was, malaria could break it overnight. Victory in the Pacific didn't depend only on tanks or aircraft carriers, it depended on whether the men could stay upright. By the end of 1943, the Americans finally started to win the silent war. Atabrine compliance increased, mosquito nets became sacred, and environmental control improved dramatically. The troops slowly adapted to the jungle's rhythm. They learned when mosquitoes bit the most, where they hid, and how to avoid their breeding grounds. Little by little, the disease curve fell. And as fewer soldiers collapsed in fever, more of them returned to the front lines strong, alert, ready. The irony of the Pacific War is that before the Americans defeated Japan, they had to defeat the jungle itself. Guns, bombs, and aircraft mattered, but so did tablets, nets, engineers, and discipline. The enemy with wings just a few millimeters long had almost crippled the world's most powerful military. But through brutal experience, science, and sheer determination, the Americans adapted. And so began one of the strangest battles of the Second World War, a battle fought not with firepower, but with medicine, not against armies, but against mosquitoes. Atabrine and the science of survival. The Pacific jungles were unforgiving, and the Americans quickly realized that discipline alone wouldn't save them. The mosquitoes kept coming, and so did the fevers, week after week. By late 1942, the U.S. Army and Navy were facing a dire reality: without a systematic medical strategy, the human cost of the campaign could outstrip any tactical or strategic victory. Enter atabrine, the bitter, yellow pill that would come to symbolize the military's new approach to disease prevention in the Pacific. Unlike a rifle or a ship, this small tablet became a frontline weapon in a war against the unseen. Atabrine, chemically known as quinacrine, was not a new discovery. Scientists had synthesized it in the 1930s as an alternative to quinine, which was becoming increasingly scarce due to Japanese occupation of Southeast Asian plantations. What made atabrine revolutionary was its effectiveness against Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest malaria parasite, and its ability to be mass-produced. For the military, however, the challenge was not invention but implementation. Troops were wary. The taste was described as nauseating, and side effects ranged from minor nausea to yellowed skin and mild gastrointestinal distress. Worse, misinformation spread faster than the disease itself. Soldiers swapped horror stories about atabrine, claiming it caused infertility or permanent illness. Initially, compliance was patchy at best. The military responded with an unprecedented combination of discipline and education. Medics became enforcers as well as teachers, conducting daily tablet rounds and insisting on proof of ingestion. Compliance was monitored strictly. In some forward areas, officers created inspection logs and counted empty wrappers, while in others, parades were held where men had to show that they had swallowed the tablets. Beyond enforcement, medical officers developed practical lessons for soldiers: how to maintain consistent daily intake, how to combine atabrine with protective clothing, and how to monitor early symptoms of malaria to prevent severe outbreaks. The psychological effect was significant. Troops gradually understood that the pill, unpleasant though it might be, was essential for survival, and a soldier who refused was risking not just himself but his entire unit. Atabrine alone, however, was not a silver bullet. The Americans understood that disease prevention required a multi-pronged approach. Scientists and engineers collaborated with medical officers to implement what became a systematic program of environmental control. Swamps were drained or filled, clogged ditches were cleared, and all standing water was treated with oil or larvicides to prevent mosquito breeding. Jungle clearings were established around campsites, removing undergrowth and cutting tall grass where mosquitoes could hide. In many island campaigns, construction teams worked ahead of combat units to prepare airstrips and campsites in ways that minimized the local mosquito population. Every engineering decision from the slope of a runway to the placement of tents was influenced by the need to control disease. The Army's approach evolved into a layered defense strategy. Personal protection, medical prophylaxis, environmental modification, and constant surveillance became the four pillars of disease prevention. Soldiers learned to wear long sleeves and pants, treat uniforms with repellents, and sleep under nets even when the heat made such precautions miserable. The logic was simple but effective: the fewer mosquitoes that could bite, the fewer parasites could enter human hosts. Combined with regular atabrine intake, this drastically reduced infection rates in units that adhered to the protocol. By 1943, studies conducted on Guadalcanal and other islands showed clear evidence: battalions with high compliance in both atabrine use and mosquito discipline had far fewer hospitalizations than those that did not. Medical intelligence played a crucial role. Doctors and field epidemiologists monitored disease trends in real time, mapping outbreaks and identifying the most aggressive mosquito species on each island. This information guided everything from where troops would establish camps to the timing of anti-larval spraying operations. Some islands required daily fogging with DDT, while others could be controlled by draining water and covering small pools. The data-driven approach was ahead of its time, combining biology, chemistry, and logistics to maintain operational readiness. Without this coordination, even the best drilled soldiers would have been casualties of disease before they ever faced enemy fire. Atabrine also transformed the relationship between soldiers and the medical corps. Initially, Many soldiers saw medics as a nuisance or even an obstacle, enforcing pills and net discipline. Over time, however, respect grew. Medics weren't just enforcing rules, they were protecting lives. The dramatic reduction in disease-related hospitalizations gave troops confidence in the strategies and, more importantly, in the science behind them. The pill, combined with mosquito nets, repellent, and environmental controls, became a symbol of survival. In letters home, soldiers sometimes mentioned atabrine with grudging humor, joking about its taste but acknowledging its effectiveness. In a place where death could arrive silently with a fever, a bitter pill became a lifeline. The strategy extended beyond frontline soldiers to naval and air crews, who faced their own exposure risks in tropical climates. Ships, particularly those supporting amphibious operations, became mobile disease control zones. Water tanks were treated, decks and living quarters sprayed, and sailors required to maintain personal prophylaxis regimens. Aircrews on reconnaissance and bombing missions over mosquito-heavy islands also carried atabrine, along with portable nets and repellent, ensuring that no segment of the military was neglected in the campaign against disease. The results of these combined efforts were remarkable. By mid-1943, some of the most dangerous islands in the Pacific saw dramatic reductions in malaria incidents. Units that had previously lost hundreds of men to fever suddenly maintained strength and effectiveness, able to engage in extended combat without catastrophic losses. The Americans had learned a harsh but vital lesson: control of disease was inseparable from military success. In a theater where the jungle itself seemed to fight with every branch, leaf, and puddle, atabrine and disciplined medical strategy leveled the playing field. It was not just a pill, it was a tactical weapon, a symbol of modern science triumphing over natural adversity, and a crucial factor in winning a war on distant islands. Through this process, the United States also laid the groundwork for modern military medicine. The lessons learned in the Pacific: mass prophylaxis, environmental engineering, epidemiological surveillance, and strict personal discipline would later inform not only subsequent conflicts but also civilian public health campaigns worldwide. Atabrine's story illustrates a fundamental truth of warfare: victory does not depend solely on guns, tanks, or planes. Sometimes, it depends on the quiet, persistent application of knowledge and discipline against the smallest of foes. In the jungles of the Pacific, that small foe was the mosquito, and atabrine was humanity's first effective counterstrike. The chapter closes with a sobering reflection: soldiers who fought valiantly with rifles and artillery were still vulnerable to organisms invisible to the naked eye. By combining pharmacology, environmental science, and rigorous enforcement, the Americans turned the tide not just on malaria and dengue, but on the hidden dimension of war itself. Survival became a science, a daily ritual, and ultimately a decisive factor in the success of the Pacific Campaign. The story of atabrine is not just a tale of a pill, but of innovation, discipline, and the relentless human drive to adapt and endure even when the enemy is smaller than a pinhead, and invisible to the eye. Jungle routine: survival in the mosquito war. The first morning on a Pacific island was disorienting. Soldiers emerged from damp tents into a world that was both breathtaking and hostile. Sunlight filtered through towering palms, and the air smelled of wet earth, salt, and decay. But within minutes, the quiet beauty gave way to a different reality: the relentless buzz of mosquitoes. For the American troops, survival no longer depended solely on rifles or grenades, it depended on every decision made before dawn, at dusk, and every hour in between. Their daily routine had been reshaped by an invisible enemy, and adaptation became as crucial as courage. Morning started with inspection. Platoon leaders walked the rows of men, checking that uniforms were properly tucked, sleeves rolled down, boots laced, and socks covering ankles. Soldiers applied repellent with the precision of a ritual, a process that now required as much attention as loading weapons. Medics monitored atabrine compliance, checking that each man had taken his pill the night before and again that morning if required. The pills had become part of the uniform. Refusal was no longer merely disobedience, it was a hazard to the entire unit. Soldiers who had once shrugged off hygiene lessons now learned to treat them as matters of life and death. Breakfast was hurried and functional, eaten under mosquito nets whenever possible. Insects were not picky, they would bite anywhere exposed, and early mornings were peak feeding times. Mess tents became zones of constant vigilance. Nets, oiling of wooden floors, and insect screens on windows were standard. Soldiers learned to tolerate the oppressive heat trapped inside netting because the alternative, a day bedridden with fever, was far worse. Hydration was critical too, but water containers were carefully monitored to avoid breeding sites. Any spilled water was immediately cleaned up, any puddle reported. Soldiers joked about policing your own sweat, but the laughter was thin and wary. After breakfast came patrols and work assignments, each meticulously timed to minimize exposure. Officers studied maps with mosquito breeding sites marked, identifying high-risk zones where standing water accumulated or vegetation was thickest. Engineers followed behind combat units, draining ditches, cutting undergrowth, and spraying larvicide in stagnant pools. Soldiers carried small bottles of repellent and treated clothing, applying them whenever they paused in the undergrowth. A moment's lapse could mean fever within days. The jungle, the soldiers realized, demanded constant attention. Complacency was dangerous, whether it came in the form of unrolled sleeves, a skipped atabrine tablet, or a momentary pause near a puddle. Midday was a time of rest but not for relaxation. Fever could strike suddenly, and exhaustion lowered resistance to infection. Troops learned to nap in shaded areas, under nets or tarps, while medics circulated to observe any early signs of sickness. Soldiers who felt faint or dizzy were immediately escorted to infirmaries, as a single untreated case could quickly become multiple cases in cramped sleeping quarters. Even in brief rests, vigilance was paramount. Personal habits, once casual, became disciplined rituals. Boots were checked for moisture, socks changed frequently, and hands washed to prevent secondary infections. Every aspect of the routine, from clothing to hydration to sanitation, was interwoven with disease prevention. Evening brought another surge of mosquito activity. Soldiers prepared for what became known as dusk drills. Sleeves pulled down, trousers tucked into boots, nets inspected for holes. Repellent was reapplied, atabrine doses recorded, and tents positioned to minimize standing water nearby. Units often conducted mock inspections, as if preparing for a parade, but the consequences were real. One lapse could mean dozens of cases the next week. Stories circulated about soldiers who ignored the rules, thinking mosquitoes harmless, only to be knocked out for days by malaria or dengue. By now, the troops had internalized the grim calculus: it was easier to fight mosquitoes than to fight disease after infection. Nighttime was a test of endurance. Tents filled with the low, constant hum of insects, and soldiers learned to navigate without disturbing the protective nets. Patrols at night required special precautions: repellent, long clothing, careful movements, and constant awareness of high-risk areas near standing water. Some islands had thick fogs that trapped humidity, intensifying mosquito activity. Men who had survived day after day now confronted another challenge: staying alert and disease-free in the darkness. Sleep was necessary for physical recovery, but it came under the constraints of protection. Even a brief lapse meant potential infection. Field adaptations went beyond personal habits. Soldiers improvised new methods for mosquito control in temporary camps. Small fires were lit strategically to create smoke barriers, mud walls constructed to redirect water flow, and even improvised net frames made from branches and ropes. Soldiers documented what worked and what failed, passing knowledge from one unit to another. The military encouraged these innovations, recognizing that local knowledge and improvisation were essential in environments far removed from mainland supply chains. Troops were learning that the jungle could be tamed, not by force, but by understanding and manipulation of the ecosystem. Medical units continued to monitor outbreaks closely. Field hospitals doubled as epidemiological centers, tracking symptoms, recording cases, and identifying high-risk areas. These data informed rotations, quarantine measures, and the allocation of atabrine. Soldiers were amazed at the sophistication of disease surveillance maps marked not only with enemy positions, but also with mosquito density and fever reports. The modern concept of combat medicine was being rewritten. Survival depended as much on understanding vectors and pathogens as on marksmanship or strategy. Over months, the routine became ingrained. Soldiers no longer saw these actions as extra work, they were instinctive. Sleeves stayed rolled down, boots were always laced tightly, and atabrine was swallowed without complaint. Units that maintained discipline in these daily routines maintained combat readiness, while those that ignored them suffered repeated outbreaks. Commanders noted that operational effectiveness in tropical environments was directly proportional to adherence to disease prevention measures. It was a profound lesson. In the Pacific War, daily survival rituals could determine the outcome of battles. By 1944, the mosquito war had become an essential part of military culture in the Pacific. Troops learned to respect their environment, to treat the jungle itself as a partner in strategy, and to recognize that science and discipline were as important as courage and firepower. The jungle remained hostile, but soldiers could coexist with it, mitigating its dangers through routine, knowledge, and adaptation. The lesson extended beyond individual health. It was a strategic imperative. Malaria and dengue were no longer just medical concerns, they were central to planning, logistics, and operational success. In the end, survival in the Pacific jungles required more than bravery. It demanded daily diligence, constant awareness, and a willingness to follow protocols that might seem tedious or inconvenient. Soldiers came to understand that the enemy was not only visible forces with guns but also invisible vectors carrying lethal pathogens. Their daily routine, the unglamorous, painstaking sequence of inspections, net checks, pill taking, and environmental management became a frontline defense, a silent but decisive battle that determined whether they lived to fight another day. The jungle was unforgiving, but discipline and science allowed the Americans not just to survive, but ultimately to triumph. Lessons from the jungle, disease and victory. The Pacific Campaign was won not just with firepower, strategy, and courage, but with knowledge, the kind that could not be delivered by bullets or bombs. By 1944, American forces had accumulated years of experience combating more than the Japanese. They had fought a relentless, microscopic enemy that thrived in the very environment they sought to conquer. Malaria and dengue were not abstract threats, they shaped the outcome of campaigns, determined troop readiness, and influenced every tactical decision from the Solomon Islands to the Marianas. The lessons learned were profound, and they extended far beyond the war itself. Commanders came to understand a critical truth: soldiers were only as effective as their health allowed. A regiment at full strength could perform feats of strategy that a decimated one could not. During the early Guadalcanal campaign, outbreaks of malaria incapacitated entire companies, forcing repeated adjustments to plans and supply lines. Ships arrived to reinforce islands only to find that men could not fight effectively. Lessons were learned the hard way. Proper medical preparation was a prerequisite for military success. The cost of ignoring disease control had been evident in thousands of lost man days and the near collapse of some frontline units. The military hierarchy realized that preventing illness was as much a matter of planning as securing ammunition or intelligence. This understanding drove innovation. Atabrine distribution became a central logistical concern, with supply lines specifically dedicated to ensuring no soldier went without the medication. Field officers maintained meticulous records of intake and compliance, while medics were empowered to enforce strict protocols. These measures, while tedious, dramatically improved troop readiness. When later campaigns took place on islands with even denser mosquito populations, the lessons from earlier experiences allowed American forces to sustain operational strength. Units that followed disease prevention protocols closely were able to execute extended operations, including amphibious assaults and jungle patrols, without suffering catastrophic loss from fever and infection. Beyond medication, environmental management emerged as an essential component of military strategy. Engineers and soldiers worked together to modify terrain, drain breeding grounds, and remove stagnant water. Temporary airstrips and encampments were designed to minimize exposure to mosquitoes, incorporating drainage, vegetation management, and chemical treatment. Even small decisions where to place tents, how to orient trenches, when to schedule patrols were influenced by knowledge of disease vectors. Soldiers learned to map their own survival in ways that mirrored tactical maps of enemy positions. Success was no longer measured solely in enemy casualties, it was also measured by the number of men who remained healthy and combat ready. The cumulative effect of these practices reshaped military medicine. Field hospitals began functioning as centers of both treatment and research. Data collected in remote islands informed decisions about troop movements, preventive measures, and medical interventions. Epidemiologists identified patterns of transmission, tracked outbreaks, and advised commanders on risk areas. This scientific approach to disease control marked a significant evolution in the conduct of war. The American military learned to fight two battles simultaneously, one against enemy forces, and one against pathogens that could undo every strategic advantage. In addition to immediate military outcomes, these strategies had long-term impacts. The lessons of atabrine distribution, vector control, and disciplined preventive routines influenced post-war public health campaigns worldwide. Malaria control programs in Asia, Africa, and South America benefited from techniques developed in the Pacific War. Soldiers returning home carried knowledge about personal hygiene, vector awareness, and disease prevention, contributing to broader public health education. What had begun as a tactical necessity in a remote theater of war became a template for combating vector-borne diseases globally. The psychological impact on soldiers was also significant. Initially, the strict routines, atabrine compliance, net inspections, repellent application felt restrictive and intrusive. But over time, troops developed a sense of mastery over the environment. The jungle, once seen as an unpredictable and deadly force, became something that could be understood, managed, and mitigated. This empowerment reinforced morale and cohesion within units. Soldiers learned to value discipline not as an arbitrary rule but as a direct instrument of survival. The ability to control one's exposure to disease became as critical to combat effectiveness as marksmanship or tactical skill. Perhaps the most striking lesson was humility. The Pacific War reminded commanders and soldiers alike that even the most technologically advanced military could be humbled by nature. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and artillery could not stop a mosquito from transmitting malaria or dengue. The lesson was clear: No matter how sophisticated a force, understanding and respecting the environment was essential. War in tropical regions demanded an integrated approach combining science, medicine, and strategy. Those who ignored this lesson paid the price, while those who embraced it thrived. By the final campaigns of 1945, American forces had developed a level of operational resilience that seemed almost unthinkable in the early years of the war. Units could conduct prolonged operations in some of the most inhospitable islands, sustain strength, and adapt to sudden outbreaks. Disease-related casualties had dropped dramatically, and soldiers' survival depended as much on preventive routines as on combat skills. In many ways, the Pacific War was a laboratory of survival, illustrating how human ingenuity, discipline, and scientific application could overcome even the most persistent natural threats. The legacy of these experiences extended far beyond military applications. Modern tropical medicine owes much to the research and techniques developed during these campaigns. Vector control strategies, prophylactic treatments, and epidemiological surveillance methods that began as measures to protect soldiers became foundational tools in global public health. The story of atabrine and mosquito discipline is not just a military story, it is a story of how humans can adapt to and mitigate the threats of their environment through knowledge, organization, and innovation. In conclusion, the battle against malaria and dengue in the Pacific War offers profound insights into the intersection of health and strategy. It demonstrates that survival and victory are inseparable from understanding and respecting the natural world. Soldiers who mastered the jungle routine, adhered to strict preventive measures, and embraced scientific guidance lived to fight another day and, ultimately, contributed to the broader success of the campaign. The Pacific War teaches that invisible enemies, microbes, vectors, and disease can shape the outcome of history as decisively as armies, navies, and air forces. Victory required courage, but it also required vigilance, discipline, and the application of science in the most remote and hostile corners of the world.